What do you think of when you hear New York City? Do you think of sights such as these? These are often the common attractions people usually think of when in relation to New York City. However, as a New York native, I think of things such as the train people ride to and from work every day, the local mom and pop shops, and lastly, our corner grocery stores, also known as bodegas. But what if I told you that what I think of when I think of my home, New York City, is slowly disappearing? It is slowly disappearing due to a thing called gentrification. Gentrification is when new money arrives to an established urban district, which leads to change in its urban district's character and embedded culture. Gentrification has greatly affected Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and uptown Manhattan. These places that were once filled with immigrants trying to live out the American dream have had to find new homes. Gentrification started in the late 90s with people that call themselves urban pioneers. These pioneers are young, dedicated, and usually don't fit the traditional demographics of the neighborhood. Being predominantly white and artistically inclined, they see potential for growth in abandoned or bad neighborhoods. Through building businesses such as art galleries and music venues, which ends up making these areas desirable, real estate developers, along with upper middle class people who work in the area, become attracted to these areas. These real estate developers then start making new buildings or converting old ones to luxury condos. As well as mom and pop shops are purchased or never get to renew their leases again, which lead franchises such as Starbucks, Subways, and McDonald's to move on in. Gentrification is easily explained as an invasion of the rich and displacement of the poor. Sadly, it has greatly impacted the rents for both local businesses and apartments, particularly Williamsburg and Greenpoint in Brooklyn. They have had a rent increase of nearly 79% since 2000. This area is prime example of what gentrification is. By becoming a popular entertainment district, it has brought in wealthy new residents. A little over a decade ago, rent in these areas in Brooklyn would be anywhere from $600 to $800 monthly. However, now it is roughly $3,055 for a one-bedroom apartment, making areas like Williamsburg and downtown Brooklyn one of the most expensive and desirable in the entire city, when not too long ago it was referred to as the ghetto. Here's a prime example of gentrification. Same building, just remodeled. Along with downtown Brooklyn is now known as Dubrow, and Brownsville has directories in every corner to show its new potential residents around the town. Many people know like the back of their hand. In interviews conducted by Hamel Parasol, researcher at Temple University, residents of Manhattan and Brooklyn, who all identified as blue-collar workers, ultimately agreed that by choosing to stay in their gentrified neighborhoods led them to struggling financially, socially, and politically within the neighborhood they have always considered home. All these residents also explained how the displacement happened with many of the people they once considered to be their neighbors. Most residents saw that the steadily high increase in rent and decided that the cost was a lot more effective to move elsewhere and purchase their own home outside of the city. They feared the loss of culture in their neighborhoods more than the displacement. Culture was placed there by local artists and mom and pop shop stores that were no longer there. These interviews ultimately reminded me of my great-grandmother, who at 87 years of age was forced out of her apartment. My grandmother came to the United States from the Dominican Republic in the late 1950s and set roots in Harlem. After living in a 3-bedroom apartment with controlled rent for over 50 years, she found herself in a tough situation. In the early 2000s, this area became key for gentrification, and it all started with a Starbucks and a Whole Foods supermarket in the corner. The owner of her building complex sold it to one of the real estate developers, which in turn offered her $20,000 for her to move out. My grandmother chose to not comply with their request, especially since she had controlled rent, and this was the only place that at this point she knew as home. This led them to not fix anything that broke in her apartment and figured she would follow with their request soon after. Within a year, there was a broken pipe, leaky roofs, and countless clogged drains. In turn, this led her to comply with their offer due to the poor living conditions. Which makes you think, how many people have they done this to, or even worse? Residents have also suffered from a decrease of their local mom and pop shops. Here is the evolution of what mom and pop shops have become. Either franchises or upscale eateries. Sadly, the ratio of opening to closing of small businesses in New York is equal to, for every 10 to 12% of businesses open, 10 to 12% of businesses also do close. During this period of gentrification, roughly half of the new businesses open survive at least 5 years. Meanwhile, only a quarter survive 10 or more years. In the United States as a whole, minorities own nearly 5% of businesses. So to think in these gentrified neighborhoods, it is rapidly decreasing as rent continuously rises. My father, a Latino, small business owner, has also had his share of dealing with gentrification in the neighborhood of the South Bronx. Approximately 3 years ago, his landlord wanted to sell his restaurant's location, along with the building above, to a real estate developer, which led him to trying to trick my father into breaking his lease. Thankfully, my father, as a smart businessman, got to the core of it, ended up going to court and fighting the landlord because 2 years after the ordeal, he did not want to renew his lease. Even though he pays on time and has a pretty successful business. However, gentrification in the area has been both great and not so good for business. The new residents can't identify with the environment or the food. Meanwhile, the locals who are trying to assimilate with the gentrification thoroughly enjoy the food served at the restaurant because it is part of their culture. Culture is something very important to New York City natives. Unfortunately, along with mom and pop shops, graffiti murals such as 5 Points have disappeared. This is 5 Points. It was once seen as the graffiti temple of Queens and was one of the most beautiful sights that you could see as you were riding the 7 train. However, what was once seen as 5 Points is no longer there. As of November 2014, Long Island City, Queens, said goodbye to one of its most iconic cultural identifiers. It was taken down to make room for, you guessed it, new luxury condominiums, primarily because the investors saw it as a distasteful view. Gentrification has taken away a lot of the native New York City, but it is never too late to stop it from happening. According to the professor of urban affairs and planning at Hunter College, Ann Gotti, there are steps that we need to take in order to diminish gentrification. 1, we must first educate ourselves and our neighbors in how gentrification truly works. With understanding the process and planning, we are a step ahead of developers. Remember, planning and developing is not an overnight process. 2, we can ensure that the actual and upcoming generations have or obtain the qualifications and requirements needed to hold positions in our community. Having a voice is a big part of taking back our communities. 3, we must all become familiar with the policies that protect us and our families, particularly from displacement or mistreatment from those developers. By knowing such policies, it will give us the upper hand in all matters in relation to gentrification. Michael Jordan once said, "If you're trying to achieve, there will be roadblocks. I've had them. Everyone has had them. But obstacles don't have to stop you. If you run into a wall, don't turn around and give up. Figure out how to climb it. Go through and work around it." As a native of New York City, I personally will not give in to displacement. New York City is home to many as myself, and there is a way to persevere.